Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Helen, for the introduction. My name is Abbie MacKinnon, and I am the Curator for Space Technology at the Science Museum in London, as you just heard. I'm thrilled to be speaking at this event today, and I'm looking forward to the presentations from our amazing panel shortly. Over the next little while, I'm going to take you on a little journey through time and space with museum artifacts as our guide. I will highlight how places like the Science Museum, and also indeed places like the Yorkshire Museum here, I will highlight how places like museums can play a powerful role in engaging the public with science and technology, especially through space, and that's space with a big S, not a little one. I'll share my own unexpected journey into a STEM-related career before looking at what it means to curate space technology today and some of the ways we use objects to bring complex ideas to life. I will also touch on the concept of something we call science capital and how museums can help build it, inspiring people of all ages and backgrounds into science and technology fields and see themselves as belonging in that space. Finally, I'll highlight how we connect historical and contemporary space stories to create meaningful and inspiring experiences for our visitors to the museum. So, as Helen mentioned, the Science Museum is just one of 6 sites that form the Science Museum Group, which includes the National Railway Museum right here in York. We share our rich, diverse, and internationally significant collection of 7.3 million items covering science, technology, engineering, and medicine, with around 5 million visitors a year across all our sites, with millions more online. The Science Museum in London welcomes 3 million visitors each year, including hundreds of thousands of children on school trips, and space is a huge part of the draw for our visitors. In fact, it is one of the main reasons people cite for coming to the Science Museum. So my background is a bit unusual for someone who finds themselves in what is probably considered a STEM career. I say probably considered because even today I find it difficult to believe that I am doing something STEM related. Growing up, I was a humanities person to my very core and grew up in a humanities-based family. My dad worked for a publishing company, but researched and wrote historical nonfiction in the little spare time that he had. My mom was a graphic designer with an incredible creative brain and was also a writer herself. I was dragged to many museums, and especially American Civil War battlefields as a kid, as you can see on the screen, which despite my excessive eye rolling at the time, had a really big impact on my interests and my career goals. Maths and science were simply subjects I had to complete to graduate. I did the bare minimum in both high school and university. The subjects did not come easily to me, and at some point early on, my parents were unable to help me at home. So how on earth did I end up at the Science Museum? After graduating, I did a bit of teaching, and during a school history trip to the World War I battlefields in Belgium and France, as you do, I found myself gripped by a story a tour guide told us about a spoon that was found in the trench that we were standing in at the time. This inspirational moment took me by surprise because I was a mere chaperone on this trip. It was the students that were meant to be inspired. Maybe some of them were, I don't know. But in any case, the tour guide was holding this spoon as he spoke, pointing out a hole in the center of it, likely made by a bullet. But somehow, the archaeologists, had tracked down the person whose spoon it was and were able to place him in that very spot we were standing. I could not get the story out of my head. The spoon and the location and the skill of the storyteller had brought the war alive in a way I somehow had not managed to experience prior to this moment. After I got back home, I mulled this event over. Where could I do this? Where could I combine my love for research and writing and storytelling and make it into a career? Eventually, I decided that perhaps a museum might be a place where I could tell stories like that. and inspire others through objects, as that tour guide did for me. So I moved to London, and I applied to every, and I mean every, entry-level cultural institution I could find. And it was Assistant Curator of Technologies and Engineering at the Science Museum, where I finally got my foot in the door of museums. As a slight aside, when I told my mom that I got the job, she was obviously thrilled, but she did say, "But wait, do you need to know about science to work there?" And I said, "Evidently not." So my line manager in that first role happened to look after the space technology collection. And so suddenly, I found myself being asked to research and learn about space, a subject that I had never thought about beyond needing to learn the names and order of the planets in the solar system at school. As I discovered over the next year, studying objects was a near perfect way into this technical subject for me. Abstract concepts and theories were in the form of concrete objects right in front of me. Space gradually became a real passion of mine. It snuck up on me, and imagine my surprise when a new job was eventually posted, Curator of Space Technology. And reading the job description, I discovered, much to my surprise, that I actually ticked a lot of the boxes. So what does a Curator of Space Technology actually do, you might be wondering? Well, it's quite a wide range of things, in fact, and has evolved from what curators of a few decades ago would do, which involved gallery development, but also a lot more academic research into collection areas. There are currently just over 2,400 objects in the space technology collection. In our capacity as researchers, we oftentimes refer to these objects as material culture. My main role revolves around researching, understanding, and interpreting our space technology collection for the general public. I work on exhibitions and galleries, selecting objects to display, writing the labels, working with colleagues to write briefs for diagrams and digital assets like animations or short films that help explain a specific topic. I also do TV, radio, and print interviews around current events within the space industry. I lend expertise to other departments in the museum working on space-related materials or events. I write blog posts for our website, attend meetings with space industry businesses to learn all I can about their work. And I deliver tours to groups big and small, and this is just to name a few things. I'm not going to bore you with the whole list. The first object to enter the space technology collection was in 1949. You can see it here on the screen. It is an engine from a German V-2 rocket, which was used during the Blitz in World War II in London and Antwerp. And so it is with this engine, which also represents the dawn of the space age, that the museum began a collection which steadily grew alongside the space ecosystem, with additional objects added steadily throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, until today. The collection has objects which predate the European Space Agency, known then as the European Space Research Organization. It has the real Apollo 10 command module, which was the dress rehearsal for the moon landings 2 months later in 1969. It has a Black Arrow rocket from 1972, to date the only successful British rocket program. It has objects from the very first UK-developed suite of satellites known as Ariel. More recently, we have added the structural thermal model of the Bepi-Colombo spacecraft, a joint mission between the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency, and which is currently on its final approach to study Mercury. I will touch on some of these objects in more detail shortly. But I use this incredible collection alongside expert knowledge from people like our panelists here today, and I translate it for adults, children, and family visitors, both to the museum and online. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 sparked a push in the West for investment in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to try and close the gap with the Soviet Union. This STEM skills gap continues today, and many companies in these sectors struggle to recruit for early career roles. Museums have a really big role to play in helping bridge this gap. Using material culture, they can provide context to difficult concepts, translating them into real-world applications. There's an opportunity for experiential learning and interactive exhibits, building science capital in visitors to the museum. What is science capital, though? Science capital is something we refer to a lot at the museum. It is a research-backed concept developed through a partnership between the Science Museum and King's College London. It aims to address social inequalities in science participation. Science capital is the sum of all your science-related knowledge, attitudes, experiences, and social contacts. You can visualize this through a rucksack. Imagine it is filled with all the science you know, how you think about that science, what you do in your free time, and the attitudes of the people around you, so your family, your friends, your teachers. Essentially, it is your scientific literacy. At the Science Museum, we focus heavily on building science capital in our visitors, adding to that rucksack. And it starts with making our galleries, labels, shows, and interactives inclusive. We aim to bring history, science, and technology alive for visitors, sparking curiosity and interest in the varied world of space exploration, no matter your age or your background. Ultimately, it is about making people feel like museums, and the content that is inside them are a place for them. This also relates to giving the adults accompanying kids the confidence to talk about things and answer questions, because the science capital of the adult with the children is also incredibly relevant and important in that science capital ecosystem. We know from audience research we have conducted at the museum that the role real or authentic objects plays in visitor engagement with subjects is really important. It helps to spark that amazement and curiosity, which in turn builds science capital and engages visitors in a really special way. In terms of the space technology collection, space-flown items are the ultimate prize. When you do have something that has been into space and come back again, ideally with a charred exterior after it survives re-entry to Earth, you get an incredible opportunity to inspire both kids and adults. I stand up here and say that with confidence because I was one of those people inspired by this amazing collection full of authentic objects. Now, space-flown objects are quite difficult to come by. Most things that go up don't come back. And so we also work hard to explain the importance of testing and prototypes in developing technologies. This also allows us to touch on development processes, including the importance of failure to our audiences. Testing, verification, and failure are fundamental to space development, and without it, missions would not be successful. But after all that effort is done, there is nothing better than seeing people in a gallery that you helped to create, reading the panels, pointing to things that they see, leaning down to a child and explaining something, or a child asking their grown-up a question. Space is a STEM subject which has an incredible power to inspire a lifelong interest in science and technology. Last summer, we had to close our beloved Exploring Space Gallery, which had been open to the public for an incredible 39 years. Last year, 50% of visitors said they went to this gallery before it closed. In September, we opened our brand new space gallery, some of which you can see on the screen now, which 70% of people reported visiting last year. So we know that through space, we can have a big impact on our visitors. I will now take you through some specific examples of objects, both from the collection and on display, highlighting some of the tools we use at the museum to engage and inspire. The first object display I ever worked on was a spacecraft called Bepi Colombo. Bepi-Colombo is a 2-spacecraft mission to explore Mercury. It launched in October 2018 from French Guiana on an Ariane 5 rocket. The flight model spacecraft, so that means the one that actually launched, was built by Airbus in Stevenage. But they also built a 1-to-1 scale structural thermal model for all the intense temperature and structural tests. You can see that on the screen here. On a visit to Airbus's Stevenage site, our director spotted the Bepi-Colombo spacecraft and asked if we could perhaps display it at the Science Museum when they were done with it. After much discussion and a lot of bureaucracy, we put it on display in May of 2018, 5 months ahead of the flight model's October launch date. This was an exciting and unusual situation to have this STM spacecraft on display prior to the launch of the real spacecraft presented a really unique opportunity. As a brief aside, what you can't actually tell from the slide is that I had my special Bepi-Colombo t-shirt on, which is emblazoned with the project's sort of tagline, "Some like it hot," which is a very delightful reference to the temperature of Mercury, which is very hot. But back to the display. Around the time of launch, which incidentally was in the middle of the night in the UK, so we were not able to live stream it, but we did have our explainer learning team positioned around the spacecraft at certain times of the day to speak to visitors about the upcoming launch. Here they could engage with visitors and describe the intense and long journey the spacecraft would take. 8 years, including 6 flybys of Mercury, 2 flybys of Venus, and 1 flyby of Earth. They could point out things on the displayed structural model, like the patches on the multi-layer insulation blanket, where engineers tested alternative materials to help better control the temperature extremes the spacecraft would encounter on the journey to Mercury. They also had a selection of objects with them, called the Object Handling Collection. These were things collected by our volunteers and related to Bepi-Colombo or space technology, space travel, exploration in some way. In a museum where the norm is glass cases and no touching, being able to hold objects and talk about them is something our visitors and our volunteers really enjoy. And it is through conversations like this between explainer or volunteers and visitor that are so essential to engagement. Through this object, we give a fuller picture of the methods engineers use to ensure the success of a planetary mission. It reveals the challenges and failures engineers face and what it takes to overcome them. It shows the complexities of spacecraft development and the importance of vigorous testing to ensure mission success. And we have another exciting opportunity with this object, because the Bepi flight model arrives at Mercury finally in November of this year. So once again, we have a chance to bring this mission into the museum and make it come alive for our visitors. It is a unique one too, as the Science Museum is the only place in the world where people can see a full-scale version of Bepi-Colombo. Hopefully people recognize these two faces. At the museum, space is a unique opportunity to link our museum collection and displays with current events. For instance, the recent Artemis II mission, which saw the first person of color and the first woman to travel to the moon, as well as the first time humans have been back to the moon in over 50 years, was a huge draw for the general public. These moments are incredible opportunities, and there is a whole generation of kids and adults out there, myself included, that did not experience the hype, excitement, and inspiration of the Apollo program, which landed the first humans on the moon in July 1969. Artemis has the chance to be that moment for a generation of kids and adults. While Artemis objects are currently difficult to come by, I think they're using most of them, but we're working on it, Apollo program objects, like the Apollo 10 command module on the screen, nicknamed Charlie Brown, can be a way to link historical and contemporary stories. Now up here on the screen is the real Apollo 10 command module, which was the dress rehearsal for Apollo 11 in July 1969. I stress that because you would not believe the number of visitors who come and believe it's a replica in front of them. So we clearly have to do a better job of being clear it's real. It flew 3 astronauts. Flew 3 astronauts. Commander Thomas Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Eugene Cernan, all the way to the moon, where they deployed the lunar module, flying it to just 14 kilometers above the surface of the moon, before returning to the command module and coming back to Earth. Now, this is not quite what Artemis II did. It was, in fact, Artemis II was more like Apollo 8. However, you can easily link these 2 missions in their preparation of the eventual moon landings. One of the ways to connect these 2 programs is through a little fun fact. Since it flew in 1969, Apollo 10 has held the speed record for a crewed vehicle, coming in at 24,791 miles per hour. It's pretty fast. Now, in the lead up to Artemis II, it was thought that the Orion capsule might just break that record. So we at the museum waited with interest, probably the only people in the world that were waiting with interest to find out the speed, to find out what kind of speed Orion would clock. As it turns out, Apollo 10 kept hold of that record, but just by 127 miles per hour. So not quite overtaken by Artemis II's return. More generally, the hype around Artemis II was even greater than we'd hoped for at the museum. It helped, too, that it happened around the Easter holidays, and so the museum, and especially the Space Gallery, was packed with children and families, soaking up all things space. I also found Artemis II a really special moment from a personal point of view. I have a 6-year-old, and he asked me, or begged me, I should say, to wake him up so he could watch the Artemis launch. I agreed. I didn't actually need that much persuading. And that was a really special moment, watching it with him in real time. Sticking with the Apollo program, another prized object we have on display is the Apollo Simulator Control Panel. This control panel comes from just one of 3 simulators which every single Apollo astronaut trained on prior to going to the moon. What is so inspiring about this object is that you can see the annotations and equations from the astronauts' own hands on the control panel. It adds a human element to the object and allows visitors to imagine the rigorous training that astronauts had to undertake to leave Earth for a place that humans had never been before. Like Apollo and Artemis, making historical objects relevant to current events or contemporary stories is a useful tactic to help make space accessible and relevant to visitors. Some of you might be aware that the UK is aiming to have the first launch site in Europe. Saxe-Aboard Spaceport in Shetland is looking like it will be the first vertical spaceport to successfully launch a payload into orbit from the UK. I mentioned previously that we have the 4th and final Black Arrow rocket in our collection. Black Arrow was the UK's first rocket program, and it launched 4 times from Woomera, Australia, between 1969 and 1971. In 1971, the UK government cancelled the Black Arrow program. But as the final rocket was already in Australia and the British satellite called Prospero was ready to go, the final flight was permitted to launch. Unlike the previous launches, this one was successful, and to this day is the first and only successful orbital launch to be conducted by the UK. This rather sad claim to fame, however, should imminently be overtaken as Saxe-Aboard Spaceport readies to launch Rocket Factory Osberg's RFA-1 launch vehicle, marking the UK's first commercial vertical orbital launch. Framing Black Arrow in this way allows us to reference upcoming space events like this. Now, we can't always do this specifically in gallery labels, as we are, being a large museum, we're not the most nimble at updating labels, and we also can't predict the future, but we have other ways of talking about and interpreting objects. In person through tours, but also online through our collections online portal, our social media accounts, blog posts, and also research papers. I will also mention that while it was perhaps a shame that the program was canceled, it did benefit us because there was one final rocket completed but not launched, and it was donated to the museum in 1972, where we can continue to tell its story for many more decades to come. In the new Space Gallery, we have also utilized a 20-meter-long wall. Rather than putting a bunch of object cases alongside it, we decided to use it as a place-setting opportunity. Given the strong links to the moon, both in our collection, on display, and with future missions like Artemis, we decided that a moonscape would be ideal. We are always devoted to being as authentic as possible, and so we chose a moonscape taken in 1972 from the very last mission to the lunar surface, Apollo 17, and the last time a human has ever set foot on the moon. How do we make sure people know it's a moonscape, though, and how do we make it interesting? Well, we made sure to choose one that had a great big astronaut in it, because nothing says moon like a person in an EVA suit, and we even managed to get a moon buggy and the lunar lander in the distance, which you can't actually see on the screen. We were then able to add some interpretation panels alongside the image to provide more information and context around the science of lunar exploration. For example, what gets left behind on the moon and why Apollo astronauts' footprints will be on the moon for thousands of years, how this image was made, and of course, every 8-year-old's burning question, how much poo is on the moon? You wouldn't believe how many people want to know about that kind of thing. When we are developing a new gallery, linking to educational key stages is also essential to make things relevant for children and educators. We have more visits from school groups than any other museum in the UK, and so we must link to the curriculum wherever possible. We use our Space on a Sphere globe, which displays a selection of planets and moons from our solar system, linking to Key Stage 1 and 2. The narration, which incidentally is done by the first British astronaut, Helen Sharman, takes visitors on an audio and visual tour with interesting facts, links to the search for life, and upcoming missions to explore Saturn and Jupiter's icy moons. I find her soft Yorkshire accent very soothing to listen to. This is a display that existed in the previous Exploring Space Gallery, and we know from audience research that it was one of the most popular exhibits in the gallery. Because of this, we made every effort to reinstall it in the new Space Gallery, though we did update the script and the imagery to help keep it fresh for our visitors. We also aim, when we can, and when we have the funding, to engage with the public beyond the walls of our own museum. In 2017, the Science Museum put on display one of the most significant objects in our collection, the Soyuz descent module. This spacecraft took the first British European Space Agency astronaut, Tim Peake, safely to the International Space Station and back again. He landed back on Earth on the 18th of June 2016 in the Kazakhstan steppe, and by the end of that calendar year, we had added that spacecraft to our collection. In 2017, that same spacecraft went on display in the Science Museum on its first stop of a 20-month tour of 8 venues around the United Kingdom. Some of you perhaps maybe saw it. The tour launched at the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, then on to Locomotion in Shildon, the National Railway Museum here in York, the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, then onto a rather unusual venue for a spacecraft, which you can see on the screen here, the Peterborough Cathedral, which won a national competition to host the tour. National Museum Cardiff and Belfast's Ulster Transport Museum were the final 2 stops. Not only did the Soyuz descent module, parachute, and Tim Peake's spacesuit travel to these venues, but it also had a traveling VR experience. This was a 360-degree 3D VR experience supported by Samsung and with cooperation from Tim Peake and the European Space Agency. Visitors could experience what it felt like to sit inside the Soyuz as it made its dangerous, high-speed journey back to Earth. This tour reached 1.3 million visitors across 20 months. Compared with the same period of the year previous, Locomotion in Shildon saw a 200% increase in visitors, and Peterborough Cathedral saw a whopping 900% increase. Additionally, the tour had a learning program targeted at local schools for each venue. This included a school visit by the SMG outreach team to deliver a science show, a visit by the students to their local tour venue to see the spacecraft and spacesuit, and a visit by the touring VR experience bus, which you can see on the screen. The age group was 13 to 16-year-olds in areas local to the tour sites where museum visits are not common, and so otherwise they would not have had the opportunity to see the objects. The bus reached 51 schools across the UK while the spacecraft was on tour. Sometimes things from space are not man-made, and while perhaps they look like they could be earthly, they are in fact quite alien and are gold dust for scientists to study. 2 such samples are on display in the Space Gallery. They are a moon rock sample, pictured here, collected by Apollo 15 astronaut David Scott, and a sample from an asteroid called Ryugu, collected by the Japanese Space Agency's spacecraft Hayabusa 2. Unfortunately, I didn't have a good image of that, so you'll have to imagine a tiny speck. This specially equipped spacecraft traveled 6 billion kilometers to safely return the sample to Earth in 2020. While these might be slightly unremarkable to look at, understanding that these 2 samples, the moon rock and the asteroid grain, are 4.5 and 4.6 billion years old respectively, as old as our solar system, really does make your jaw drop. Neither have ever touched Earth's atmosphere and are incredible specimens for scientists to study, allowing them to learn more about how our Earth and the solar system formed, including testing and revising scientific theories which explain how life may have evolved on Earth. As part of our interpretation methods in the Space Gallery, not only do we utilize material culture to convey excitement and engage with complex topics, but we highlight the people behind the technology and science. For the asteroid Ryugu sample I just mentioned, we showcase the scientists from just next door to us at the Natural History Museum. Dr. Sarah Russell studies meteorites, but with these new sample return missions from asteroids like Ryugu and also NASA's OSIRIS-REx mission to the asteroid Bennu, means she is now able to study pure samples, allowing for an analysis which is untainted by Earth's atmosphere. Bringing people to the forefront of the galleries as much as possible is another important mission at the Science Museum. This not only humanizes the science and technology in front of people, but it also showcases the vast array of jobs and the diversity of people in these roles. In addition to Sarah, who I just mentioned, another example from the gallery is Katherine Johnson, who was a NASA mathematician in the 1950s and 60s. As a Black woman, she faced discrimination in the workplace, even though her expertise was crucial in getting astronauts safely home. She worked on many programs, but according to an interview with her, her most memorable one was Apollo. She calculated exactly when the lunar lander would need to launch from the surface of the moon to successfully dock with the orbiting command module and get the astronauts home. Many of you may know her story from the book or Hollywood film, Hidden Figures. Another example is Zoe Clark. Zoe started out at Spire Global, a satellite company based in Glasgow, as a 16-year-old apprentice and worked her way up, learning about satellites and developing a strong understanding of engineering and teamwork. This dedication led her to where she is now, a mission manager overseeing the launches of Spire satellites. It is through stories like these about real people where visitors will hopefully see themselves reflected in the gallery and believe that they too can have a job in the space industry, We want people of all backgrounds to believe that STEM spaces are for them. So to summarize, I have finally come to the end. Some of the main takeaways from my talk today: museums, through authentic objects, inclusive storytelling, and relevant programming, like the Tim Peake Soyuz Tour, which extends the impact beyond the museum's walls, plays a vital role in making STEM accessible, building science capital, and inspiring diverse audiences to engage with science and technology. Effective interpretation links objects to exciting stories and current events. Live interpretation using our explainers and team of volunteers are key to deepening engagement beyond the static displays. So, museums are powerful STEM gateways, and space is a major attraction, especially drawing in families and school groups. Learning through objects helps to provide an accessible and inclusive way in for people like me who might struggle with science and maths in school. Real objects, especially space-flown ones, are uniquely powerful in sparking this curiosity. So, my final message: take yourselves, take your kids, your nieces, your nephews, your grandchildren, your neighbors down to your local museum, and when you are in London, please come and check out the new Space Gallery. It's a place for everyone, and it's free. Thank you.
We're going to get started. So we had a great insight from Abbie into, thinking about the storytelling aspect and that nice idea of sort of science capital. We're going to put some things in your rucksack now. I'm sure it's already filled to the brim with science capital, but we're just going to try and squeeze in a few more interesting objects. And then after, each of the panelists are going to give about 7 minutes or so discussion or talk, and then we'll have, I'm sure, a fairly random walk but fascinating conversation, which will then also include questions of yours. So we do have, it's an amazing panel. So we have Professor Carlos Frenk, who is the Ogden Professor of Fundamental Physics at Durham University and the founder of its Institute for Computational Cosmology. As I'm sure you all know, he's one of the originators of the cold dark matter theory. I think also, maybe significantly more for this region, he's just been an amazing ambassador for science and an attractor of research money and research buildings. You had played a big role in actually 2 big research buildings in Durham. We have the Astronomer Royal for Scotland, Catherine Heymans, Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Edinburgh and Director of the German Centre of Cosmological Lensing at the Ruhr University in Germany. I don't even know what lensing is, but maybe we might get onto that. She's a great expert on dark energy and dark matter, and I note that she's also promoting a book on how to design a universe, which is out in September. I think we might hear a bit more about that. And Keri Elmsly is a global curator based in London and LA, has spent a lot of time working with a wide range of artists in different media around the world, developing immersive experiences. I suspect we're going to hear more about this, and destinations, and designing and curating museums. And most importantly, maybe for this session, she founded last year PACT, Planetary Art Culture Technology, which we may be hearing about from her, but it's to amplify artists' unique utility as engines for imagination, agency, and change. And Abbie, for the discussion, is also going to join us to be part of the conversation. But Professor, shall we start with you?
Sure. Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. And so it's a great pleasure to be here. I just looking at my computer, I realized I'd been here before in this very same place some years ago. And I think I don't know what I was talking about. But in any case, I know what I'm going to talk about today. So the only cue I had from the organizer, Helen, sitting there, a very old friend of mine, was that was what I was told. Is there anybody out there? So I'm going to tell you whether we're alone in the universe or not. But a better way to phrase this is not that question, but the opposite, which is, where is everyone? And that is the way in which a very famous physicist, Enrico Fermi, in 1950, phrased a paradox, now known as Fermi's paradox. And the paradox was this: an advanced civilization like ours will inevitably colonize other planets. And we're on the verge of doing this ourselves, humans. We're very close to going to Mars and so on. And so once you move to one planet, then it's inevitable that the civilization will spread throughout the galaxy, because that's just the way things happen. And so that was Fermi's paradox. So then he said, well, the universe should be teeming with civilizations. Why haven't we seen any signs of extraterrestrials yet? Well, that question was then phrased in a more formal way by someone called Frank Drake, who died recently, and in the form of Drake's equation. Now, I know many of you are not, most of you are probably not scientists. Don't get scared by the word equation. This is really, really simple equation. And so it has an n here, which is the number of civilizations out there that would want to communicate with other civilizations. Then it has an r, which stands for the number of stars, basically, the rate of star formation in the galaxy. Then F, which is a fraction of the stars that have planets. It's not enough to have a planet. Then there's the fraction of planets that are habitable. It's not enough to be habitable. Then the fraction of habitable planets that do actually manage to engender life. And that's not enough. Life has to be intelligent. So that's F something here. Fi is the fraction of inhabitable or planets with life that develop intelligent life. Then the next one is the fraction that wish to communicate with others. And then the big uncertainty is how long do civilizations like ours last? Now, when I was a student, which in my mind, it wasn't that long ago, but people tell me that it was. But anyway, we didn't know any of these numbers. So this was all this famous Drake equation was complete unknown. We had no clue to any of this. And it's amazing how much progress there has been in the few years since I was a student. For example, we now know very precisely, thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope, we know how many stars the Milky Way galaxy, which is where we live, is making every year. It makes about 1 to 2 new stars every year. So we know the first term of the Drake equation quite well. We also, until 10, 15 years ago, we had no clue as to whether other stars had planets. And then thanks to another technological feat called the Kepler satellite, we now know that every star has at least one planet, and about 1 in 6 of those stars have a planet the size of the Earth. I'm not going to quiz you later to tell me what the numbers are. I won't do that. But so I'm going fairly quickly through this because I don't have much time. So 1 in 6 of every star has an Earth-sized planet. So they're very, very common. Now the first difficult one is, well, okay, there are all these planets. Which of those are habitable? Now that's harder because we only have one example of life, which is us. But there's a great big hint. The sun's been around for 4.5 billion years. So it formed 4.5 billion years ago. And the first signs of microbial life appears almost immediately, 3.8 billion years ago. So as soon as the Earth came down and life could emerge, it emerged. So to most people that says, well, it must be very easy to make life. We're not talking about life like us yet, we're just talking about bacterial life. So it's very likely that bacterial life is rife across the universe. In fact, most of life on Earth is in fact bacterial life. Most of the mass of life living is bacteria. So that we know. Now, which of these developed intelligent life? Now, that's a tricky one. First of all, we need to understand what do we mean by intelligent life. And I have 3 minimal requirements that I'm sure all of you here pass. You should be self-aware. You should be able to understand and learn things. And you should be able, not individually, but collectively, to modify your environment. You should be able to create technology. So those are the 3, in my mind, key aspects of intelligent life. We can talk later whether artificial intelligence can do this or not. But for now, let me take that as the definition of intelligent life. So how many of the planets that have life, bacteria, could develop intelligent life? Well, one thing we know is that here on Earth, it took 4 billion years of Darwinian evolution for the bacteria to evolve into complex life forms like us. So you need probably several billion years of evolution. And you'd say, well, the universe is so old, it's 13.7 billion years, surely that's not a big deal. Unfortunately, it is a big deal because our Earth is in the middle of a universe which is really hostile. The universe out there, and that's why being an astrophysicist is wonderful, is full of amazing explosions and all sorts of things go on. It's a very dynamic and dangerous place. Just give you some examples of things that could stop Darwinian evolution. For example, we know this from Earth. Large asteroids can create havoc, killed all the dinosaurs about 100,000 years ago. And there are stars that explode, called supernovae, and they really zap everything nearby. There are other exploding stars called gamma ray bursts. There's something called active galactic nuclei or quasars in the centers of galaxies. They spread radiation everywhere, and then galaxies tend to collide with one another. There's so many that they collide because they attract each other. So again, we didn't know any of this until a few years ago, but astrophysicists, this is what they spend their life doing. So we now know what to say about each of these 5 dangers here. So we know asteroid impacts happen every 100 million years or so. So we're due one after the dinosaurs anytime soon, so watch out for the night sky. Supernovae, unfortunately, we know how many supernovae there are, but it has to be close enough to zap the ozone in the atmosphere. And we don't know really how common these exploding stars are nearby. So unfortunately, we don't know this number between 100 million and 2 billion years, a big uncertainty. Gamma ray bursts, that we know much better, happens once every few billion years. Happily, active galactic nuclei and galaxy collisions, we don't need to worry about them. It's been shown that they are not going to impact Darwinian evolution. But unfortunately, we still have some uncertainty here. And so we'll come back to that in a minute. But the key, in my mind, and most interesting of these considerations is the last one here. How long do civilizations last? How long will our civilization last? And I'm sure all of you worry about this. I do, because the humans are really dangerous. We're a dangerous species. And here, just human civilization, the end of it could be self-inflicted. So here, just a few examples of things that can kill us all off. Climate change, of course, and a nuclear holocaust. I mean, all these things, climate change we see happening. Nuclear holocaust, I don't want to talk about politics here, but there's one autocrat in the world who's pretty much threatened a nuclear Armageddon in Ukraine as it happens. So there's bioerror possibilities, some leak of some of some microbes that kills everyone. Bioterror, we're very worried about this just now because of the last one, which I think is the one we should really, really worry most about, which is the arrival of artificial general intelligence, which could just eat us all up. So this is a big unknown, and unfortunately that's what makes it very difficult to ask the question, are we alone or not? So we have numbers for all these. So I just told you about how many stars the Milky Way is forming. Fraction of all have a planet. About 10% have habitable planets. Life seems to be everywhere, but it's microbial life. Intelligent life, unfortunately, that's a question mark. Which choose to communicate? I think they all do. Whether you like it or not, we're already broadcasting. Our television, radio, internet, it's all over the universe already. And then the big question, which is lifetime of such civilization. So take these numbers and do your best with the question marks, with these 2 big question marks here. Then, unfortunately, the conclusion is not very satisfactory. The conclusion is that there could be between 0 and 15 million intelligent lives at any given time in the Milky Way. But what I find interesting here is not so much the 15 million, but there's a very good chance that we are alone. There's a very good chance that we are alone, either because civilizations annihilate themselves, or because there's just not enough time for human intelligence, or for intelligence like humans to evolve. So that, I think, is something that is worth thinking about. But now I just want to spend 1 minute telling you about where we're going next, what's going to happen to the human species in the future. Now, so I'm sure everybody here knows, although living in the UK, you may know there's a star nearby called the Sun. And the Sun, like all stars, has a nuclear reactor in the middle. That's why it shines. It has a nuclear reactor, but it requires nuclear fuel, and nuclear fuel is finite. So eventually, unfortunately, the Sun will die out because you'll run out of nuclear fuel. This is going to happen in about 5 billion years, and it'll become, so the center will collapse, and this we know extremely well in astrophysics. The outer parts will expand, it'll become something called a red giant, and the sun will engulf the Earth and burn everything on the surface. So that's going to happen in 5 billion years. So you might say, whew, what a respite. Well, don't relax and sit back, because something is going to happen much sooner than that, and that's in 1 billion years. The suns, because of the way the nuclear reactions work, it's going to get hot, a little bit hotter, only 10% hotter, but that will be enough to boil all the oceans, and so at that point, really, there's no hope. So, what's going to happen then? Well, we got 1 billion years to figure it out, and we need to get out of our planet if our species, our descendants is going to survive. So I just like to finish off by making you wonder, what will our descendants look like? What do you think our descendants will look like 1 billion years from now? So here I'm inspired by my mentor, Martin Rees, Lord Martin Rees, who said many times that in 1 billion years, our descendants will be as different from us as we are from bacteria, because 1 billion years ago, life was just bacteria. So what would they look like? Well, they may be, for example, they could be genetically modified posthumans. That's certainly a possibility. They could be all robots. That's another possibility. The one I like best, and I think Martin also likes this one, is that we just our descendants might be cyborgs, part human and part computer. So that's what the future holds, and I would leave you here to ponder about two things. Is it possible that we're really alone? And whether we are or not, what will happen 1 billion years from now? We've got to get out of this planet, and hopefully one of these successors to us will sort the way out to do this. Okay, thanks.
Hello, everyone. Let's see, how does this work? There we go. Hi, so I am Scotland's Astronomer Royal. Come all the way down from Scotland. Say hello to you all on this lovely day at the York Festival of Ideas. Thanks for the invite. And as Carlos said, we were tasked with the question, is there anybody out there? And Carlos has tried to answer the question of, is there another planet out there in our galaxy where maybe a civilization has formed that's built beautiful cities and wonderful towns like York? And I agree with everything that he says. It could be that we're looking at life outside our own galaxy. And I think it's probably likely that there's somebody else out there. Quite a small chance we'll ever talk to them. So I thought instead of reiterating Carlos's point, I'd start thinking about, is there anybody out there looking at us through their computer screen? Because if these civilizations across our own galaxy and out in the universe who have built cities have also built data centers, large computer centers that can crunch enormous amounts of numbers, then Elon Musk tells us that we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation with cosmological overlords watching us from on high. So let's give them a little wave. Now, I don't usually agree with Elon Musk, but he's got a reasonably good argument here, because if we look at our own reality, we find it is mathematical. Our universe is mathematical. And if you left mathematics at school, you're probably thinking that is a strange thing to say, because maths is 2 + 2 = 4. But maths is the framework, the language that we use to describe our reality. And if we look at our reality, we find that it is governed by 4 fundamental forces, and we understand the mathematics of these fundamental forces really, really well, to such an extent that we can use mathematics to predict what happens in the future, and then that happens. And this mathematical description of our universe is incredibly accurate and works really well. So these 4 fundamental forces, there's electromagnetism that governs your experience of reality, the way you hear, you see, your taste, sound, touch, your conscious experience of reality is all thanks to the electromagnetic force field. We can't fly no matter how much we want to. That is because of the gravitational force. We understand the mathematics of gravity really, really well. If we zoomed right down into the atoms inside our body, they are being held together by the strong force. If that didn't exist, all of the atoms in your body would simply fall apart. And the fourth one is something called the weak force. That doesn't really impact your everyday experience of reality, but it does mean that the sun can shine, so it's quite a useful force to have. We understand the mathematics of all of this, and that means that we can use that mathematics to program a computer to create virtual realities that mimic our own. And we do this already. So here are two images of a galaxy. The one on the right-hand side is taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. It's a real galaxy in our real world. The one on the left-hand side was made by Carlos in his computer in Durham. They look pretty similar. Carlos's one looks even better because in his computer he can zoom right into it, whereas from our viewpoint on planet Earth we get that more blurry image on the right-hand side. We can also run computer simulations of how our own planet formed, and this is what we think our solar system would have looked like about 4.5 billion years ago, when the planets were forming in our solar system. Anyone who has played a computer game or has a child or a grandchild that is addicted to computer games, you know that we can also simulate human movement, human muscles, the way we run, the way we speak and talk. Computers can create these virtual realities that are already very similar to our own experience of life. And so Elon Musk says that as we look forward to the future, as technology develops, we will be able, and the fact that our universe is mathematical, we will be able in the future to create virtual realities that are so perfect in every detail that they are completely indistinguishable from our experience of reality. And I've been thinking about this for quite a while, and when I first started thinking about it, courtesy of my 13-year-old who said one day, "Mum, are we living in a computer game?" I was like, I didn't have an answer. And I had a bit of an existential crisis because my job as an astronomer is to take images of our universe and to use that to explore what's out there. And when you look out into the universe, it's absolutely teeming with galaxies, which are teeming with billions of stars, billions of planets. For sure there are civilizations out there who will have developed these technological advances. And what Elon Musk says is that the chances that we are living in a real world are vanishingly small just because it is going to be so simple to create these virtual realities where virtual people live and walk around. So I didn't really like that because I feel real. You feel real? Yeah? Everyone feels real here. Yeah, you feel real. I didn't like this. So I started thinking about it quite deeply. And I think there's one thing that Elon didn't consider. And we can go back to 1637 for this. René Descartes. Je pense, donc je suis. It's gone off the side. I think, therefore I am. Your conscious experience of reality is going to be hard to code, for a computer to code. Because I think if you really are going to be able to create your conscious experience, you're going to have to simulate absolutely everything. This isn't a computer simulation. This is a tiny, tiny view. It's about 1 millimeter across of a slice of a human brain. All of these things are neurons in your brain. Those are what's creating your conscious experience. We don't really understand consciousness, but we think it. And what I've been working on for the last few years is thinking about how much energy would we need to simulate absolutely everything, including everything in everyone's brain, so we all have that conscious experience of our reality. there's just not enough energy in our universe, is the long and short of the situation, to be able to build a perfect virtual reality that we could all live in is simply not possible given the energy constraints of our universe. And so I think Elon Musk is wrong. I cannot tell you that you are definitely living in the real world, because there is a chance, our universe is mathematical, we could code it, we could do it with enough energy, but I'd say it is very, very improbable. So, in answer to the question, is there anybody out there? I think somebody definitely out there in the universe somewhere, but probably not watching us on your computer screen. And I'm looking forward to discussing this with our panel members, but if you are interested in my whole journey to this thought process, I have a book coming out in September. It's called How to Design a Universe, the Science of Real and Virtual Worlds. Yeah, it's quite fun. There are lots of jokes in it as well. Right, good. Thank you.
I'm just going to push the button and the computer's going to do the job. Hello, I'm not going to answer the question because I'm really not qualified to answer it. So I thought I would think about what usually happens when we go out into space, usually being only very few times in the last century, and lucky for us it happened this year. And some of you may have watched avidly on YouTube the launch and cried a little bit like I did, or taught my grandkid about blast off. And it reminded me around when we first went to the moon and the whole Earth catalogue, and how humans inherently look back at themselves. And so you go out to discover something and then you turn around and go, but what about me? And the whole Earth catalogue is a sort of reaction from the 1960s to NASA's first venture into space. And really that's what people do, is they try and make systems and stories of how they fit into the universe and ways that we can inhabit and live. And we tell ourselves stories, and some of us are not scientists, and yet we've found through the mythology of something like NASA and the way they've structured themselves, and they've undergone tremendous change in the last year, we have the opportunity to sort of use designers and artists as a way to interpret science that we've been so beautifully explained to about, you know, why we go to museums. But I got to go to NASA JPL like a complete nerd with someone who worked there last year, just around what they call the Great Firing, where the Trump administration decided to fire 30% of NASA workers and then talk about how important it was to go to space again. So it's a kind of strange thing. And inside JPL, it's the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. It's the experimental part of NASA that has a studio that was run by a guy called Dan Goods. And the whole point of the studio was to communicate and have creative ideas that could inform how NASA went about its critical work. So, you know, the little helicopter that partnered the Mars rover? Dan's team came up with that as an idea, like not as science, but as an idea. So Dan took me around JPL, and I did a lot of crying and nerding out, and he let me take pictures of everything. And now Dan doesn't work there anymore, after 23 years, because that's the wave of change the administration of NASA is going through. But I wanted to talk about, is there anyone out there and how we communicate with out there? And the very first act we did to try and communicate in some senses was through a record. And when I went to JPL, luckily it was their holiday party, and the archivists had got out a bunch of stuff out of the archive that no one ever gets to see. And I got to see the original acetate for the golden record, which was sent out to Voyager in 1977 as a way, led by Carl Sagan, as a way to tell the rest of the universe who humans might be. So inherently, art and music is the way we try to communicate to whoever might be out there who on Earth we are. And so what do artists do about that? Well, like many of you here, maybe they love science and space too, and they want to figure it out. So I'm just going to quickly take you through the way that I've engaged with outer space with artists like Katie Patterson, where we got a tiny piece of fragment of the moon for real. Oh, she put it on eBay. It's definitely real. And we convinced an entire infrastructure of organisation, in this case UPS, to ship this tiny little bit of the moon around the planet following the orbit of the real moon for a year. And we did that by ringing people up and going, please don't open this box, please just make sure it gets sent on this time at this day. And we built an app to follow the second moon, and we orbited it for a year. And that might seem ridiculous, but it's a way that artists like Katie start to take the complexity of the universe and deliver it to us in a way that we can kind of figure out our place in the world. And same with artists like UVA, who are minimalists in many senses. Now, I thought this was really beautiful timing, as A Distant View was made in 2017, but the image you see is made from the laser scans that were used in the first way that we tried to interpret what the moon looked like. So not photography, but these scans. And they took those scans and built them back up into sort of what you might call as reliefs, I guess. They're really just charcoal burnt wood, layered in strips. But what that does to us is it makes us see the gaps. So we've interpreted data in a way that we're like, oh, that's definitely the moon. It's not, it's just a bunch of gaps. And I thought it was a really beautiful way to think about how we comprehend and how we join those gaps and create systems with absolute minimal amounts of knowledge and computation. And back to Katie, because I love working with her, and she has such universal ideas. We have been called science criminals, I have to admit. I have been investigated by the FAA for illegal flying of drones. So, we like to skirt around things. But again, another eBay purchase, a meteorite. And Katie's idea was what does it look like when you take an object from outer space and make it into an Earth object? And so my job was to find someone who would do that for real. So I found a fabricator, we melted this meteorite down, we cut it up, which was the strangest smell, because when you cut up a meteorite, the smell of the dust that comes out of there is dust from the outer space. You've never smelt a smell like that. And we also cried then. Maybe I cried too much, I'm not sure. But we got then we got a foundry who's been operating in East London since the 18th century to recast the meteorite as itself. And it did very strange things to their forges, and it nearly blew them up, and everyone got really scared and freaked out because, in a sense, we're afraid of what we don't know, and then when objects behave in ways we don't understand, we get frightened. And then the best part is we took that meteorite and put it outside the Science Museum on the footpath for a month. And it was part of the Cultural Olympiad in 2012. And, people got upset, other people loved it, but she did it. And what I love about Katie's work is she can convince huge infrastructures of humans in administrative roles to do things they wouldn't normally do. And in this case, she got the slurry from the melted meteorite, tiny, tiny piece of it, and the European Space Agency agreed to put that, what is now an Earth object, so a space object becomes an Earth object, back into space. So that's the kind of power of a conceptual artist. And again, a black hole, Marshmallow Laser Feast, they were like, oh, we'll just try and explain black holes to average people who want to move their bodies, and using Carl Sagan's poetry. Now, we presented this at ACME, where I was a museum in Australia, where I was executive director of programming, and we thought, I don't know if everyone's just going to understand what this is about and about how really a star dying is why you're alive. And yet everyone did. We had 76,000 people come to that exhibition, and it wasn't free, they paid for it. And not only did they spend time pretending to be a black hole and a dying star, they also did a 9-minute meditation at the beginning of the exhibition, which is unheard of. And we thought no one would do it, and yet everyone did it. Because when you give people the time and the space, the literal space, to slow down and focus and question where you are in the universe, we are reminded of the power and the poetry of our own imaginations. And I think that's where narrative and landing us back on Earth, even though we've gone all the way out to the other side of the moon just this year, is humanity wants to look back and understand itself and the world it creates and how we're going to survive and who we're going to be. And I think a lot of us are asking those questions of who we're going to be right now in response to the tsunami of corporatized AI, the lack of privacy, the lack of consent. And it's not that the artists I work with and the companies I work with don't use technology and don't use AI. In fact, many of them have been machine learning researchers for a number of years. It's the corporatization and massive rush to have your decisions taken from you that I think people are what they're reacting to, and we will continue to react to that. And what's interesting is that what's coming out of all of this is that the focus on craft and taste and story. It's like, oh, what makes us human? It used to be that we were intelligent. Okay, well, now a computer is apparently more intelligent than all of us. Then, oh, what makes us human? Oh, our gut instinct. So we're going back to, it's like, you know, when tarot cards got very big in the Victorian times, is when there's times of exponential change, we jump onto mysticism and religion and magic to try and help us understand what we can't understand. But to answer Helen's question, this artwork after the end imagines a future where the giant infrastructures of extraction of oil and gas are broken down and repurposed by Indigenous people through small networks and small self-contained anti-corporatized networks and satellite control communication devices that sort of give people the control back of their world and of what's coming of the future and how we inhabit space. So that's my relationship with outer space. It's really been through the brilliant minds of artists and how they help us mediate what we don't know and how they perhaps help us think about what we'd like to know next. Thank you.
So I feel like the subject matter is even more cosmic than I initially thought, because it really is kind of the life, universe, and everything. And there's so many, I mean, there's terrific presentations, and I suspect we've all got kind of things that we're playing around with. I don't know if they're quite questions, but sort of responses to the different chats. But I am interested, you know, having had that fascinating, you're kind of skirting around the fact that you'd sometimes got into trouble on some of this stuff, a bit of the sort of artistic terrorist going around some of these places. But having had that very kind of clear point about how, you know, what do we do when we get furthest away from Earth? We always look back at Earth and say, what does it mean about us? And the role of imagination in thinking about any of these very difficult concepts. You know, we had from Abbie, is obviously, as she was describing about the science capital, it's about making people want to go, helping science by inspiring people to do science. But I wondered, I'm interested from both of you, but Carlos first maybe, you know, how much is, when there's so much that we can't see, when there's so much we don't even know anything about, how much is imagination part of advancing science? Not just being able to explain it, as you did so brilliantly, but actually being able to think about it and go ahead with it as a scientist.
I mean, imagination is a cornerstone of science. So that's why I think there's so much synergy between science and art, because they're both expressions of the highest levels of human creativity. So the computer, with AI nowadays, you can do all sorts of things. You can write computer programs 100 times faster than any of my students can. You can make them a lot more powerful. Well, what they lack is the imagination. So if you tell an AI, go and solve this problem, mathematically they will, but they will not come up and say, look, I think this is a new idea, and I think this is worth thinking about, because that is where imagination comes in. So when I mean, I have to write reference for all my students when they need a job. And one of the things I highlight when it's appropriate is the imagination and creativity, because without that, you don't even get started. It's not Science is not a mechanistic operation where you just turn the handle. It requires innovation. It requires novelty, and that only comes from imagination. So I would say imagination lies at the root of our ability to do science, and therefore lies at the root of what makes us human. So when I was talking about intelligent life, clearly imagination is a key to it. So it's part and parcel of science. Without imagination, science just becomes a technology, becomes a practical thing of no interest to anyone, and will never discover anything new.
Catherine.
Thank you. So I think there's a common misconception about science, particularly among children. So if you ask children, do you want to be a scientist today? They'll be like, nah. If you ask them, shall we do some science today? They'll say yes. So because science teachers are great, and generally the science you do at school is fun. It's creative, they're curious, the kids are really curious, but the word scientist is often associated, and various studies have shown this, that the word scientist is associated with being a genius, being a mega brain, and knowing things, knowing facts, certainty. And science couldn't be further than that. It is not, we don't know, we know nothing, do we really? It's all about, it's all uncertain. Science is about asking the big questions that we don't have answers to, and then thinking out of the box and being imaginative, being creative, coming up with new ideas of how to solve those problems, how to find the answers. And so the reality of being a scientist is so far removed from what everyone thinks being a scientist is. It makes me very sad. So I'm delighted by the sort of the arts and the science museums that are helping us share that science is actually about being really creative and imaginative. It's probably one of the most creative things you can possibly do. I work on Blackford Hill in Edinburgh. There's an observatory right on top of the hill. I skip up that hill every morning thinking, will we prove Einstein wrong today? It's fun, it's creative, it's imaginative, and yeah, absolutely, it's nothing like what I think people think a scientist is like.
How much do you, Abbie, you must have experienced that. I was asking you when we finished about whether it sort of made me want to go back to the Science Museum, and I had to just check that you were allowed to go without children, because it was sort of making me nostalgic for the times I went with kids. But is that rings true to me, that thing about scientists?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I didn't quite get a chance to talk about in my talk because of time is the kind of role of science fiction and art as well that we try and bring out at the Science Museum, because science fiction, art, it's such a good way in to the subject, which is as our panelists were saying, kind of like cannot considered to be hugely creative and so much certainty, when in fact actually it's not. And so I think it's in museums it's about bringing people in multiple different ways. I talked a lot about the objects and bringing people in through objects, but I think science fiction and art is another a really important way in for people into STEM subjects.
And I'm going to go back to you, but just. And obviously the sort of lurking fear, you both adamantly say, this is the difference with, Keri was mentioning, we're thinking more about what's unique to humans. And intelligence is no longer the thing that we're the best in the world, because there's now going to be all these computers that are much better than us at thinking. Are you confident that in 20 years or even 5 years, it'll still be the case that you can say, well, it's not very good at imagination, it's not very good at coming up with ideas? You kind of feel like computers will surely get better at having ideas.
I don't think so. I really don't. It's very interesting. If you get the computer to solve a physics problem, you say, look, here are these equations, this is a problem I want to solve. It does it for you. If it makes a mistake, it doesn't even realize, because it has no intuition. So it has what we call physical intuition. When my student comes up with a graph, I can immediately tell, you got a bug. Your computer is not working properly, because I've been around long enough that I have intuition. Intuition is imagination. And computers just do not have that. They will do problems in amazing ways. They no doubt will be an engine of progress in science, but they will never come up with anything that is truly new. They're not going to make any discoveries that are fundamental about our universe. They will tell you how proteins fall. They will come and design new medicines, new treatments. They will be wonderful at taking scans of your body and telling you what's wrong with you. That they will do. But doing something that is really original, innovative, in my case, discovering something fundamental about the universe, I don't think that will ever happen. I had this discussion with Demos Hassabis, the founder of AlphaGo, and I think I may have persuaded him in the end, but I'm not completely sure. It was some years ago, so maybe he's changed his mind. But I use AI all the time, and I'm aware of the limitations, and I think that is the main barrier. So just one last thing, though, because I think the synergy with art and science is a really important thing. I'm surprised to see the fraction of scientists, practicing professional scientists, who do art on the side as amateurs. I mean, the number of performers of instruments and of music, for example, everything from jazz to classical music. Some of my colleagues are really, really accomplished. I have another one, we all keep it secret, who paints wonderful pictures and so on. So I have another friend who his notebook fell and it was full of poetry. So why? Well, because I think it triggers the same kind of neuron activity to do science, to do art. And it just appeals to the best of humans. And so I think that's intrinsically a human attribute. I don't think a machine can learn to do imagination. It can write poetry, but not original poetry.
I'm going to hold that thought about it appeals to the best, because I feel like we're also getting an image of science and technology, and Keri kind of hinted at this, from the tech bros. You know, the most symbolic of technological innovation in our world at the moment I don't feel like they're doing poetry on the side. I might be wrong. But Keri, I mean, you were joking about crying all the time. But why is it that space in particular makes us cry? And are we going to end up thinking that it's just, I mean, going back to this thing of, are we a computer simulation? Are we going to go back to thinking that maybe it's just crying that makes us human?
I mean, I wish I had the answers. I'm too sentimental, but I think
But everybody cries when they see space. I mean, a lot of people cry.
Yeah, and it's been fascinating to that unifying, like, how many times... I'm not a massive YouTube watcher, actually, so the fact that NASA YouTube channel is my new favorite, and, like, I keep replaying these things, it's because I think we're moved by endeavour, right? And these endeavours... Sometimes it's so symbolic of something great, but an endeavour is so small in some ways, and that's perhaps what moves us, is just being able to appreciate what huge leaps are possible, and space is maybe the biggest, most vast representation of that. But that endeavour piece can be, somebody actually just getting out of bed in the morning.
And Catherine, I couldn't help thinking, we had the uniting thought between the two of you was that maybe if you think that we're all in a computer simulation, that it's easier to fire people, because that's basically what Elon was doing a year ago.
Well, yeah, if you are all in a computer simulation, then it is all being run by mathematics, and then you lose your free will, and so it doesn't necessarily make it easier to fire people because...
But you shouldn't feel bad.
You shouldn't feel bad because you had no free will and it was just the maths that sent you in that direction. There's a nice get out of that one, though, in that you can still be happy that the universe is mathematical and that physics is determining how everything moves, but that our construction, the way we all work, means that we're kind of above all of that low-level physics, and so you can still have your sense of free will. It kind of works. The philosophers call it compatibilism. I think they cheat. Anyway, sorry, we digress. Just one thing on AI, to add to what Carlos was saying. Humans give value to inventions. So there are lots of different people who paint, who do different art, music, but what becomes popular, or what we consider, what are the great artists, what are the great musicians of all time, that's because humans decide that they have value. And there are lots of musicians who haven't made it big because the humans decided they were rubbish. So yes, AI may be able to create things. You may be able to ask your computer to create a lovely image to advertise your event or whatever. But it's up to us as humans to define whether that has value or not. And I think part of the problem with AI is that we're because it's new and shiny, we're giving it value. And actually, the human innovation and creation is much more valuable for us. And so it's kind of up to us as a community to go, that AI picture is absolute rubbish. This one made by a real artist. Because you can see the difference, you can see the creativity. This is what I give value to. And I think that will mean that we get the benefits from AI, as Carlos was talking about, and not the downsides of it, just slop everywhere.
Abbie, that's obviously, there's other parts of the Science Museum that will be sort of grappling with this, but I think it's to the extent that the sort of AI is making everyone think about the nature of humanity and everything else, does that affect the way you also are thinking about drawing people in? I mean, it's striking, you did emphasize how you use individuals to bring space alive, but are you having to sort of grapple with some of that?
Yes. It is something that, we are starting to grapple with, and it's only going to kind of increase. AI has moved so fast in the last, even just in the last kind of 5 years, that it can be quite hard to keep up with all of it. But I think one of the things that I think all of us have kind of touched on in different ways is we just always circle back to humans, and we always circle back to people. And I think that, thinking about Artemis and the kind of how inspiring that was, and it is so much about looking back at us, and it's just so unifying because, space exploration and seeing humans go out and explore outside of our own planet is something that every single person, no matter who they are, where they are in the world, can kind of look up and think, oh my gosh, like that is incredible endeavor, an incredible feat of humanity, of technological development, of science. And I think that is something that I've been thinking a lot about with the space collection and at the Science Museum is how do we bring these kind of big ideas, especially when it comes to kind of space science and learning, why are we learning about other planets? Why does that matter? Why does it matter to look outwards and to try and look for life elsewhere when we probably aren't even going to be able to communicate with them, even if we found it? And I think it is always about kind of reflecting back on ourselves. And so making that connection is, I think, really important for our visitors, because they always just want to know, why should I care? And so I think that's a big part of what we try to do.
But it's interesting because I feel, obviously it's always been a feature of these of sort of space conversations, is there life out there and extraterrestrials and all that. But I feel like that has become, to your point about it's all about projecting ourselves. I sort of feel like the endeavor aspect, the us projecting onto further realms always seems to be a way bigger element than sort of, is there anybody out there?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think because admittedly humans are entirely egotistical, selfish creatures, right? Look at the way we treat our own planet. And I think one of the efforts of going out there, a lot of the science, like the SETI Institute, for example, SETI does a tremendous amount of work in the oceans and sort of discovering out there's a lot of methodologies and scientists that can help us here. And that work goes very undersung, but they do a tremendous amount of, deep sea discovery. And so I think if we can use what we project out to channel towards, how we can stay. I know we've only got 1 billion years, but I feel like we could try and make it a good billion, right? And so that level of care and just quest, if applied on Earth, imagine what we could solve. And it's the same, some of those, the big, like, if only Elon was determined to help a bit out, help on Earth, not just to get us off Earth, how much could we solve? And it's the same with the tremendous amounts of capital being flung at data centres that make drinking water undrinkable in people's towns. You know, that level of effort, those problem solving could be applied here. And I think, so maybe it's just a bit of a switch to flip where, you know, we put it there, but what if we applied the same level here?
Well, I think we could probably, I suspect there will be some questions, although I also want to get along to a little bit more kind of some of the more mundane or sort of local things. But was there, and there's people who have microphones, I think. Was there a question?
Just to go with what you were saying about how we value things and to jump off of that point, I do think it's important that we think about participatory things with the public in terms of science. Obviously, we were talking about how it can be like a unifying force and things like that. But I think maybe not a challenge to that, but a counterpoint is the fact that during a lot of these space launches, especially kind of outer orbit, there was one recently that was done by Amazon that was, I think it was like Katy Perry and things, and it had like a photo shoot. I think it had a bit of backlash because it did feel quite estranged from the material realities that a lot of people are living at the minute. And it's about how do you square a lot of these like inventions and innovations in space that are receiving a lot of funds with how people on Earth might experience daily realities that can be quite estranged from that in a lot of ways. And it's just thinking about how we talk about how exciting and unifying all these things are, but a lot of the funding that's went into space programs, it's kind of contrasted by the lack of funds that go into, as we said, public water and things like that. Yeah. And it's about how we challenge the kind of technocratic imaginaries of space with giving people more agency on kind of like a public level. Yeah,
that's well said. Yeah.
So you are right. There was a bit of a backlash about Katy Perry, but there's a counterpoint as well. So that there were so many young girls who love Katy Perry, who saw her going up into space looking super glamorous, and suddenly saw a different future for themselves. And so you can love her or hate what she did, but she did transform people's aspirations, particularly young girls' aspirations of what they can do. And I think, you know, science and technology has made the current climate that we're in, climate crisis that we're in. It's you know, it is the industrial revolution that has caused the problems that we have with our climate crisis. But science can also find the solutions. But at the moment, the people who tend to go into science, it tends to be, it's predominantly privileged white men. And I think when we are trying to solve as big a problem as the climate crisis, we need so many different voices to come in. You know, I said we are asking the questions that nobody has asked or answered before, and if all of us come from the same background, the same schooling, we're not going to find a solution. And so diversity of thought is really important with science, and so it is therefore really important to see people like Katy Perry going up into space to encourage young girls and people from different backgrounds that a science and a space future is for them, because the future is space. There is a lot of effort going into it, love it or hate it, that's where we're going. But that scientific thought, that scientific process will also flow through to solutions to the climate crisis. Because at the end of the day, the technocrats are going to realise that we aren't going to be leaving planet Earth. Mars is a very inhospitable place for us to go. We will all die there within 5-10 years because there is no magnetic field to protect you from the sun's harmful solar rays. I don't know why Elon Musk wants to go there. Anyway, they are going to realise that soon. They are going to have to get on board with solving the climate crisis, but we need a really strong scientific workforce to make that happen. At the moment, that's just not happening. Fewer people are taking science at school, and they don't see that as their future. So
Just to push back on that, because I think I agree with you, obviously, in terms of diversity and everything else. But surely those little girls are actually looking at Katy Perry, thinking, "I want to be a fantastic pop star who then has, so that I can be successful enough that some rich guy will pay for me to go in the rocket." I mean, she hadn't done, it's sort of the opposite of what you're talking about. She hadn't done years of training. She hadn't gone into physics and done the role model about going into STEM. Even if you have diversity, you're taking it seriously and
no, she went on various TV and she said that she'd been reading about string theory. She said that she'd been reading about astronomy. You can laugh about it, but I go to lots of different schools, particularly disadvantaged schools in Scotland, and it genuinely made a difference. Okay. They genuinely were excited about that Katy Perry had gone into space, and there was a lot of negativity around it at the time, and I was like, don't be negative, we should celebrate everyone's successes. Okay. And she's a powerful, successful woman, and we should celebrate her for doing that.
Abbie?
I totally agree with everything that you said. I just wanted to point out too that a story that you wouldn't have heard, because I didn't know about it until very recently when I was doing a bit of research, is that Blue Origin, who was the company that sent Katy Perry up into space. I use that term quite loosely because 11 minutes they spent that whole flight was 11 minutes long. But they also, it's kind of flights like that helped to fund a woman called Michaela. She's from Germany, and she is in a wheelchair. And she also flew on a Blue Origin flight as the first person in a wheelchair to ever go into space, even if it was very briefly. They had to make some adaptations and things for her so that she could access the spacecraft and experience it in the same way. Their program actually got cancelled recently, or paused, but they were going to send the first partially sighted person. Actually, I think they sent the first partially sighted person, and they were going to send a blind person into space. Quite interesting. How do you experience that when you can't see, and what adaptations would they have made? Anyway, so I just wanted to kind of point that out because you don't hear those stories.
Okay, I'll stop being the cynic.
Sort of building on this theme, and I'm the festival's director, we've got a whole day on Sunday exploring the intersection between the future of democracy, technology, and humanity. But my question, therefore, is if we are seeing concentrated power and investment coming from a very small handful of people, at least one of whom appears to believe we are living in a computer simulation, the danger of having such concentrations of investment and power using technology for good or ill. Do you have a view of any of the panel about how the scientific community itself can propose better levels of accountability, or are there other measures that communities and individuals should be asking their elected politicians to think about from that oversight point of view?
And yes, and I guess there's sort of a broader thing that comes from that, which is just, we are this is an era in which, and I made a joke about it earlier, but these handful of technologists are particularly dominant in terms of sort of the narrative of society and power and money, and also they are particularly, almost every one of them, particularly sort of obsessed with space and blowing up a lot of rockets in order to get some other ones up there. So I think there is that, you embody, Carlos, a kind of, a fantastically positive model of science, and has also brought a lot to the local area and everything else. But the risk is that science is just taken over. You get a backlash against science because of this. And is there a way to push back on that? I think actually, Keri, you wanted to respond.
I wanted to talk about civics actually and citizenship because what happens when you get such an imbalance is subculture responds to that and creates self-organizing systems. So in the case of civics and art, there's an organization called the Dark Forest Collective, or there's movements like things called cyberdicks, where people are making their own computers out of recycled things. So the Dark Forest Collective and Yancey Strickler, who again changed economics through Kickstarter, which is again bringing your own support and your own community to support to get projects off the ground. He's just brought into law in Colorado artist corporations, which again is structures and organizations that fight back against this sort of complete concentration of power. And I'm working with a lot of young technologists and venture capitalists in London who are very, very self-organizing and about distributing wealth and power through their own means and their own discussions. And then with cultural festivals and the way that art is sort of emerging, is that DIY ethos continues to take hold, but underpinning all of this is how do you want to be involved in society? And civics is not a word that maybe is commonly, but the work I do as a curator is driven by civics and driven by wanting to participate in what it is to have human agency. And I think agency is the most important thing we can sort of circle around, is if you don't want to be involved in something, what system are you making that fights back or is instead of just throwing your hands up and not being involved at all?
Let me answer that in a slightly weird way. I always like weirdness. So and this is something I think all humans share, at least all the ones I've met. I mean, I had a very good friend when I was a student who was blind, and he could not participate in this, but there is the sense of awe about the universe. So in the audience here, has there been anybody, maybe this is the wrong country for this, but who's looked out on the sky and not just felt an overwhelming sense of awe when you see stars, planets? That's how I became a scientist. I went hiking, I was born in Mexico, I went hiking in the south, and it was too hot, so I got out of my tent, got out of my sleeping bag, fell asleep, and then in the middle of the night I woke up, and there was the Milky Way. There were stars everywhere. I could reach them, I could touch them, and I was overwhelmed by this feeling. I decided I want to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out where this comes from. So I've spoken to many people in the world. I've spoken to everyone shares that sense of awe. I think it's intrinsic to being human. It's part of our nature as humans. And it's regardless of even age, gender, religion, ethnic background, everybody shares that one common human feature. Right? Am I right? I mean, is there anybody here who hasn't experienced that great awe? Well, we may, because, and I'm going to come back to the question, we may be the last generation who has that experience. We talked a lot about Mr. Musk, for whom I have absolutely no time at all, for various reasons. Now, one of the great things he's done is probably deprive future generations of having that sense of awe, because the Starlink set of satellites that he's sending out there is basically the end, not just of astronomy, but is the end of that ability we have to look at the stars. Why? Because at the moment there are not that many, there's 500,000 or something, they block the light from the universe, so they scatter it. So for astronomy, this is really, really bad news. And not just Musk himself, he started the whole thing, but there's many more companies following suit. Now the Chinese talk about not 1 million or 10 million, 100 million of these things. The sky is going to be glowing in a few years with these satellites that are just reflecting light from outer space. It's the end of astronomy, and it's the end of the night sky. Now, so the American Astronomical Society talked to Musk and said, look, this is really a real danger for one of the most ancient and most appealing of sciences, astronomy. You're going to kill off astronomy. He didn't seem to be too bothered, but he said, okay, well, I'll paint my satellites black so they won't reflect that much. Of course, they still reflect. It doesn't matter what color they are. And now they're talking even about putting data centers out there.
Yeah.
Just imagine how bright this is going to be. So I think this is one of the downsides of technology. So it's wonderful to have internet that you can broadcast to everywhere, wherever, no matter how rich or poor you are. It's played a key role, for example, in Ukraine, helping guide drones and so on. Yet, that is the flip side of technology. And somehow you have to be able to set limits to that kind of thing. And I don't think anybody takes this seriously. And it is not, I mean, Catherine knows all about this. She's Astronomer Royal. She's a real danger that in 10 years' time, we just won't be able to do astronomy anymore professionally. And in that period of time, people will look up on the sky and you'll see this thing glowing all the time. No stars, no galaxies, no anything. So that is one example of the flip side of technology. And there are many more that I could go on but I won't.
You're not reassuring me, or maybe us, that there isn't going to be also this sort of backlash against science, in the sense of people associating science now with more negative. There's always been a mixture of negative and positive. And obviously we had all the debates from the Manhattan Project and everything else. But it feels like it's become it's going to be potentially more toxic, more polarizing.
Yeah,
and then you just add astronomers are going to be out there along with everybody else campaigning.
I mean, when people say that to me, I just say, well, you remember the pandemic, right? Who saved the day? It wasn't Boris Johnson. It wasn't the politicians. It wasn't the financiers. It was the scientists, and not the scientists who created the vaccine. The ones before them who discovered the RNA that was the basis of these vaccines. So that was just pure science at its best. These people studying RNA, they didn't think there was going to be a pandemic. They weren't thinking of a vaccine. They were trying to understand nature, the biology of living creatures. They came up with the RNA, and then that gave us the vaccines, and without that, it's not clear we would be here. So those are the kind of stories we need to tell. The stories of positive, how science can be positive, how it enriches our life, and there are downsides, and we have to be aware of those. And that's where I wish our politicians were a little bit more science savvy, because they don't understand this. All governments in the world should be up in arms, saying to Mr. Musk, stop sending satellites. These constellations are going to ruin even humans' experience of being in the cosmos. So that is one side, but the other side is to tell the good news of science. I mean, science done wonderful things for, even now, I mean, you see people's lifespans have increased dramatically. I was at a meeting at a conference in Spain yesterday. I was talking to a 93-year-old physicist who stood up and gave a wonderful talk. Now, it was unthinkable when I was a kid. Why has he survived this long? Well, thanks to advances in medicine and science. And so I think there's a very good news to tell about science, but it's not all unmitigated good news. There are a flip side, and those are the ones we have to guard against.
Well, it is noticeable that there's just a very different attitude. We're starting to have quite a negative attitude to science often, or at least certainly to AI, to scientific innovation in the US and in many Western countries. And it's the complete opposite in China and Asia and India and everywhere. Still has a very positive, they associate it with positive things, for better or worse.
And the amount of investment, for example, in China, I have, at the moment, because our government here is not so keen on the kind of basic science that Catherine and I do, there are severe cuts planned for our research. In China, it's the other way around. So most of my students now come from China, and you see them full of enthusiasm, full of energy, full of desire to do things. So, however, we must distinguish science from technology and engineering. They're not the same thing.
No, I accept.
So all this AI and so that is not science. I mean, that is just a technology. So I think it's important to keep the distinction between the two.
You might have to keep reminding people of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, I think we'll have. I tell you what, we'll just take these two because then we're going to run out of time.
I found it really interesting how AI keeps being brought into this area of space. I think as humans we suffer a lot from, I think it's called pareidolia or something, where we see human faces in things that aren't human. So like, you look at a tree and you think that's got a human face in it. It's not, it's just a tree, it's the shape of a tree. I think we have that problem quite a lot with AI especially. We look at the plagiarism machine and think that because it's able to write an email for us that it must be intelligent. I wonder how much that then kind of plagues, well not necessarily plague, it's a bit of a strong word, but how much that impacts on our search for extraterrestrial life that we, the Drake equation, when we talk about like intelligence, well, what is intelligence? Because it's how we're defining it equally as well. There was previously a talk about, how we're carbon-based life forms, but silicon could equally form the backbone of a different form of DNA. I just wonder, how much do you think that this idea of we kind of look for things that look and speak and sound and think like us, that we might either miss life forms or they might already be there and we just haven't noticed them.
Sorry, can I just take this one as well, because then we've got to finish.
It's going to be around how useful that distinction of art and science actually is. Does creating that distinction cause more harm in enabling people like Elon Musk and these technologists who really don't embrace art? Or is it more of a useful mechanism to encourage students to study STEM and distinguish it from art in that sense? Does that make sense? I don't exactly know how to word that.
I mean, that's good because it spans the whole conversation, and maybe we'll have everyone respond to whatever part of that. Do you want, Abbie, do you want?
Yeah, so I think at the Science Museum more and more, it's kind of a recent thing, we're really trying not to always, and it's difficult, but we're trying not always to have this kind of like big distinction between there's art and then there's science, and you do one or the other, and we've talked a lot already up here kind of about how these two subjects are so interrelated, and I think absolutely not mutually exclusive, and so much of science and scientists are inspired by art and inspired by literature and science fiction, and equally art is often inspired by science, and so I think that these are just two different subjects which are very highly connected in a way. I think that a lot of people, I think because in school, you have your art and typically people who, do art and they might do some, English and things like that. They don't do science, but actually they are really, really closely linked, and we try and are continuing to try to kind of bring that in through exhibitions and in our galleries. And we have art installations in all of our new galleries now to kind of try and hammer that point home.
Carlos, are we missing it?
I think that's both are fascinating questions, but let me say something to the question from there. So the very famous physicist who spent many years in Newcastle University, Paul Davies, very inspirational person, he used to talk, he spent most of his life, he was a quantum physicist, and then spent most of his life thinking about these questions of extraterrestrials and so on. So he used to distinguish between life as we know it and life as we don't know it. Now, and he will give you many examples of, life evolved the way it is based on carbon chemistry for good reasons, but you could imagine life, and you can actually have many similar chemical reactions with silicon, for example. However, one thing that I think is new is that even our descendants may be life as we don't know it. So the reason I gave you three options of how our descendants might evolve. Some could be genetically modified post-humans, but I don't know about them. But robots, I hope not, because as we said before, robots have no imagination and we'll never get it. Cyborgs are my favorite ones because they're part human and that part is the imagination and the creativity and the enthusiasm. And the other part is the Borg part, the computer part, which does calculations at an amazing speed. So those are my favorite descendants. But if you came back 1 billion years from now, I don't think life would look anything like it does now. It'd be life as we don't know it. And yes, when we look out in space to try to interpret signals, and there's a whole huge industry of that called SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, you have to be prepared to be shocked and surprised. And I'm prepared for that. My career as a scientist, I've had so many shocks and surprises of things I thought this can't be true, that I wouldn't be surprised if one day we wake up and there's in the news, we now have signals from life from outside Earth. It's not anything like what we expected. They look completely different. And that would be a fascinating development. And I hope I'm around to see that, because I think that is probably the most exciting scientific question. Are we alone? And if we're not, where's everyone?
I don't know. Keri, do you want just on the final
I was thinking about your question, and some of the most interesting art that artists I know are looking at is the more than human perspective of how do you put down the overarching selfish sort of lens of being a human, and how do you learn about interspecies communication or deep language and communication systems that live in natural ecosystems. And there's a tremendous amount of answers there, and it isn't life as we know it, but it's certainly something we can learn from right now and is packaged in ancient knowledges and ancient stories as well. So that is another kind of, life force and life system that we don't need to, it's there if we want to dig in.
Catherine, you get the last word. Art and science.
Art and science. So I think we tend to like to pigeonhole people, don't we? Or you're a geek, you're a geeky scientist, or you're more of an artist. You go in this camp, and I think this pigeonholing isn't helpful, because there's a major crisis looming. We've got one in a billion years' time, but there's something sooner than that coming in, and I think we need to think at this from all different angles, and that very early on children are being told, oh, you're not smart enough to do science, or you're not creative enough to do arts, and this pigeonholing happens really early, and I don't think that's very helpful. So if you do have young people in your life who are curious, they're all curious, no young person is not curious, just encourage them to follow what they're interested in, and support them to do that, and don't no, you're a sporty person, that's I don't think that's helpful, because the future, I think, is going to look very different from now, whether that's because of the introduction of AI or whatever. And so I think we just need to encourage our young people to follow their dreams, follow their aspirations, nurture their curiosity, and that's, I think, the sunlit uplands are there.
Okay. Well, we have had, it's light and dark, but we've had some pretty inspirational things to put in our backpacks. And I'm just sorry, we're going to try really hard this afternoon not to mention Elon Musk, but I apologise for the amount of time. It's just irritating that we should spend so much time. But there's reasons to do it. Thank you so much to everyone. We've got an hour for lunch, or just under, I guess, now, because I went slightly over. So it's 1:45 if you could be back here for place. Thank you very much.